John had always imagined that his life would be a lot easier. He was a good man, or at least he tried to be. But life had a way of overwhelming him. It was the early days of fatherhood, and John had never expected it to be so hard. Megan, his wife, had just given birth to quadruplets, and the weight of responsibility felt unbearable. At first, everything seemed like a blessing. The joy of new life, the love for his growing family. It should have been the happiest time of his life. But instead of feeling excited, John felt exhausted. The babies cried all night, and he could barely keep up with his work during the day. Megan, who had always been a calm and caring partner, seemed to be sinking under the pressure of raising 4 children at once. John tried to help, but nothing seemed enough. Megan had always been the strong one in their relationship, and John admired her for it. But as the days passed, he noticed her growing more tired, more frustrated. She was doing everything, and he was doing just enough to get by. He started to feel like he was invisible, like the life he once had was slipping away. The love he once felt for Megan started to fade. Instead of feeling like a team, they began to drift apart. One evening, after a long day of trying and failing to keep the babies calm, John snapped. He and Megan had been arguing for days, over small things, like who was doing more work and who needed more sleep. John couldn't remember the last time they had a peaceful moment together. "I need space, Megan. I can't do this," John said, his voice cracking with frustration. Megan looked at him, her eyes tired but still searching for understanding. "What do you mean? We're in this together, John. You can't just leave us." But John couldn't explain what he was feeling. He didn't know how to make it better. So, in a moment of confusion and exhaustion, he made a choice he would regret for the rest of his life. "I'm leaving," he said, turning and walking out the door. The words hung in the air between them, like a shockwave. Megan stood there, unable to say anything, as her heart broke. John didn't look back. He grabbed his coat, slammed the door behind him, and walked out into the cold night. The next few days were a blur. Megan tried to make sense of what had just happened, but there was no easy explanation. She was left alone, not just with the quadruplets, but with the knowledge that the man she loved had abandoned her. It felt like everything had fallen apart in a single heartbreaking moment. John didn't know what to do next. He found a small apartment and tried to push the thoughts of Megan and the children from his mind. But the image of their tiny faces kept creeping into his thoughts. He tried to forget, but the guilt kept following him. The harder he tried to escape, the harder it became to breathe. It was too late for regret, he thought. He had made his choice. But in his heart, John couldn't help but wonder if he had made the biggest mistake of his life. Megan's life was never the same after John left. The sound of his footsteps fading away that night echoed in her mind for days. She was left to face the challenges of raising 4 newborns by herself. At first, it was just overwhelming. The babies needed constant care, feeding, changing, comforting. And with each passing day, the exhaustion became harder to handle. Megan had always been a strong woman, but now she felt as if her strength was being tested in ways she never imagined. She would wake up in the middle of the night to the cries of one baby, then 2, then all 4. She could barely keep up with the demands of motherhood. There were days when she could barely eat or sleep. She lived for small moments of peace, like when the babies finally drifted off to sleep, and she could rest her eyes for just a few minutes. But even during the hardest days, Megan never gave up. She loved her children more than anything in the world, and she was determined to give them a happy life, even without John. She figured out how to juggle everything, getting the kids to their doctor's appointments, managing the household, and still finding time to care for herself. It wasn't easy, but Megan did it. She became the mother and father, the provider and the caregiver, all in one. The days turned into months, and months turned into years. The quadruplets grew fast, each of them developing their own unique personalities. They were healthy, curious, and full of energy. Megan was proud of the little family she had created, but there was always a hole in her heart where John had once been. As the years passed, John was never far from Megan's mind. She wondered how he was doing, if he ever thought about them, if he regretted leaving. But she couldn't afford to dwell on those thoughts. Her focus had to be on her children, on making sure they had everything they needed. The pain of his abandonment was something she learned to live with. John, on the other hand, was living a life he didn't expect. At first, leaving had felt like the only way out, but as the months went by, he realized how much he missed his family. He missed Megan's smile, her laughter, the way she always knew how to make things better. And most of all, he missed his children, who were growing up without him. But even though he missed them, John didn't know how to go back. How could he? What could he possibly say to make things right after everything he had done? He tried to move on, to live a life that wasn't constantly filled with regret, but it wasn't working. He tried to convince himself that he had made the right decision, but the guilt kept eating at him. He couldn't escape it. Months turned into years, and John's life was filled with a hollow sense of emptiness. His career was fine. He made new friends, but there was always something missing. The image of his children's faces, their laughter, and their tiny hands reaching out to him stayed with him every day. John's life had changed, but not in the way he had hoped. He realized now, more than ever, that the decision to leave had been a mistake. He had lost so much more than he had ever imagined. Years passed, and life for both John and Megan continued in very different ways. Megan's life was filled with the noise and chaos of raising 4 children. The quadruplets, now school age, were growing into unique individuals, each with their own personalities and quirks. She was proud of how they had turned out, despite the challenges. They were smart, kind, and full of life, but there were always moments when Megan couldn't help but wish that John was there to share it all with her. She had learned to cope with the absence of her husband, though the pain never fully disappeared. It was like an old scar that never really healed. Some days were harder than others, but Megan never let her children see her weakness. They had no idea about the long, lonely nights when she missed John or the tears she sometimes couldn't hold back. She had to be strong for them. Her friends and family would check in on her, offering support, but no one truly understood what it was like to raise quadruplets alone. It was a challenge like no other. There were no breaks, no time off. She couldn't just go out for a night to herself or even take a long, relaxing bath without interruption. It was a constant cycle of caring for others, and she had grown used to it. Meanwhile, John's life had gone in a different direction. He had tried to forget. After leaving, he moved into a small apartment and started over. He kept himself busy with work and occasional social events, trying to fill the hole in his heart with new experiences. He met new people, even started dating again, but nothing ever seemed to feel the same. It was as if something important was always missing. John would sometimes get updates about the kids through mutual friends or distant relatives. He heard that they were healthy, doing well in school, and growing up into great young people. It was bittersweet. On one hand, he was glad to hear that they were thriving, but on the other, he felt immense guilt. He wasn't there to watch them grow. He had missed birthdays, first steps, and school plays. He had left them without a father, and that was something he couldn't undo. As the years went on, John couldn't shake the feeling that he had made the wrong choice. He started to wonder what his life would have been like if he had stayed. Would things have been different? Would he have been a better father? The guilt ate away at him, and no matter how much he tried to distract himself, it was always there. He started to question his decision more and more, asking himself how he could have walked away from everything that mattered. Despite all of this, John continued to live his life, pretending to be okay. He had made a new life for himself, but deep down, he knew it was incomplete. He couldn't help but feel that one big mistake had changed everything, and there was no way to go back and fix it. For Megan, life went on. She didn't think about John as much anymore, focusing on raising her children the best she could. But every now and then, she would find herself remembering the life they once had, the dreams, the hopes, and the love they shared. Those memories were always bittersweet. One afternoon, as Megan was picking up the quadruplets from school, she received an unexpected call. The voice on the other end was familiar, though it had been years since she last heard it. It was John. At first, Megan couldn't believe it. Her heart raced as she listened to him explain. He had found out that the kids were now teenagers and had heard about their growth from mutual friends. He wanted to see how they were doing, to know if he could reconnect. His voice, though uncertain, was filled with a hint of regret. Megan didn't know how to feel. Part of her wanted to hang up and move on with her life, but another part of her wondered if this could be an opportunity for closure, for her and for their children. She told him it wasn't a good time, but eventually agreed to meet in person. The meeting was set for the following weekend. Megan spent the days leading up to it in a mix of nerves and curiosity. She hadn't seen John in years. Would he look the same? Would he still be the man she once loved, or had time changed him too much? More importantly, would the children be ready to meet their father after all this time? When the day finally arrived, Megan found herself standing in front of her house, waiting for John. She wasn't sure what to expect. She hadn't told the kids that John was coming. The moment felt too delicate. She didn't want to raise their hopes, only to have them dashed again. John arrived a few minutes early. He looked older, of course, but there was something familiar about him. The way he stood, a little unsure, as if he was waiting for permission to be there. Megan's heart skipped a beat as she watched him approach. "Hi," John said, his voice tentative. "I know this is unexpected, but I just wanted to see you. And the kids." Megan nodded but said nothing at first. She wasn't sure what words would be enough. It had been so long. The silence between them was heavy, filled with years of unspoken emotions. "Let me go get them," Megan finally said, turning to go inside. She called the kids into the living room, their curiosity piqued by the strange presence in their home. The moment the quadruplets walked into the room and saw John, their faces froze. They didn't know what to think. They had heard stories about their father, but had never seen him. It was like meeting a stranger. John stood up, his eyes scanning the kids' faces. They looked so different from the babies he remembered. They were taller now, their eyes bright with intelligence and curiosity. He felt a wave of guilt wash over him as he saw the children who had grown up without him. "I'm sorry," John said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I've missed so much, and I can't change that. But I want to be part of your lives again, if you'll let me." The children didn't know how to respond. They had questions, so many questions, but they didn't know where to begin. Megan watched quietly, not wanting to interfere, but her heart was heavy with the uncertainty of what would come next. It was a difficult moment for all of them, filled with the weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future. No one knew where things would go from here, but for the first time in a long while, it felt like the possibility of healing was there. The room was quiet after John's words hung in the air. The quadruplets exchanged glances, unsure of what to say. They had all heard stories about their father, but it felt strange seeing him standing there in front of them, so different from the man they imagined. Megan stood off to the side, her arms crossed tightly in front of her. She was waiting for the moment when the children would ask the hard questions, the ones she had tried so hard to avoid for years. She knew they were wondering why their father had left, why he hadn't been there for them, and it wasn't a question she could easily answer. John felt the weight of the silence pressing down on him. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt so vulnerable. He had always thought he could escape the guilt, that he could outrun the past, but standing here, facing his children, it was impossible to ignore it. "I'm sorry I wasn't there," John said softly. "I know that's not enough, but it's the truth. I thought I was doing the right thing back then, but now I see I was wrong." The quadruplets, still unsure of how to respond, watched their father closely. They each had their own feelings about him. One of the boys, Ethan, seemed the most hesitant. He had always wondered about his father, but never had the chance to meet him. Now that he was standing in front of him, he didn't know if he should be angry or hopeful. "I never knew why you left." Ethan finally spoke up, his voice a mix of confusion and frustration. "You were supposed to be there. We needed you." John's heart sank as he heard the pain in Ethan's voice. He looked at the other children, and they all had similar expressions: hurt, disappointment, and unanswered questions. Megan watched from the background, feeling the weight of the years of silence between them. "I wasn't strong enough back then," John admitted, his eyes not meeting anyone's gaze. "I thought I needed to find myself, but I didn't realize what I was leaving behind. I was selfish. I should have stayed. I should have fought for you all." The silence that followed was thick, and no one spoke for a few moments. Then finally, Mia, the eldest of the Quadruplets, spoke up. "Why didn't you come back sooner?" she asked, her voice softer than the others, but still filled with a sense of longing. John looked at her, his face full of regret. "I tried, Mia, but I didn't know how to come back after all this time. I was scared that you wouldn't want me. I thought I'd ruined everything." Megan watched her children as they processed his words. It wasn't going to be easy for them to forgive him, or even to trust him again. But hearing him say that he was sorry, that he regretted leaving, seemed to open a door they had closed off for so long. "We're not kids anymore," Mia continued, her voice still calm but firm. "We've grown up without you, and it's been hard. But we deserve the truth." John nodded, understanding. "You do, and I'm ready to give you the truth, no matter how hard it is for me to say." In that moment, the distance between them seemed a little less. The years of silence and hurt couldn't be erased with just a few words, but John knew that this was the first step. The road to rebuilding trust wouldn't be easy, but it had to start somewhere. And today, it started with the truth. The next few days after John's first meeting with the Quadruplets were filled with uncertainty. Megan didn't know how to guide them through the confusion they were all feeling. The children had heard John's apology, but the question of whether or not they could trust him again still lingered. The air in the house was different, tense and quiet, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to change. John had asked to meet the children again, but Megan hesitated. She didn't want to push them into something they weren't ready for. Yet she knew that this was a moment they couldn't ignore forever. After talking with the kids, she agreed that it might be a good idea for them to meet with John again, though they could set the pace. The day of the meeting, Megan felt nervous. It wasn't about seeing John again. It was about what her children might feel. They were at a point where they could either start to open up to him or shut him out completely. Megan wasn't sure which way it would go. When John arrived at their house that afternoon, he looked just as nervous as Megan felt. His hands were in his pockets, and he stood awkwardly by the door, unsure of how to begin. The Quadruplets entered the living room one by one, giving John curious glances, but not speaking right away. The silence was thick, and even John, who had wanted to fix everything, didn't know where to start. Megan motioned for the kids to sit down, and they all gathered around the room. Their eyes were fixed on John, waiting for him to speak first. John cleared his throat and smiled faintly, though it didn't hide the nervousness in his eyes. "I know this is strange," John began, his voice soft but sincere, "but I want to get to know each of you. I've missed so much of your lives, and I want to make up for that. I don't expect everything to be okay right away, but I want to try." There was a long pause. The Quadruplets didn't know what to say. They had spent so many years without their father, building their own world without him in it. Now he was sitting in front of them, asking for a second chance. It was difficult to process. Ethan, the oldest boy, was the first to speak. He looked at John with a mix of curiosity and uncertainty. "How do we know you won't just leave again?" he asked, his voice not unkind, but filled with the frustration of years of unanswered questions. John nodded, his heart sinking a little. He understood the doubt in Ethan's voice. "I don't know if I can ever prove that to you. All I can do is show you that I'm here, that I'm not going anywhere. I'm not asking for forgiveness right away. I just want the chance to be a part of your lives." Mia, the second oldest, gave him a thoughtful look. "And what happens if we don't want that? What if we're not ready to forgive you?" John looked at her, his expression filled with regret. "That's okay. I understand. I can't change the past, but I'm here now. If you need time, I'll wait." The others listened quietly. They didn't know how to feel, but they could sense the sincerity in John's voice. It wasn't easy to forget the hurt he had caused, but there was something in his tone, something that made them feel like he was genuinely trying to make things right. The rest of the afternoon was quiet. John didn't try to force anything. He simply spent time with them, asking about their lives, their interests, and their dreams. It was a strange meeting, filled with more silence than words, but it felt like a small step towards something new. Megan watched from the side, feeling a mixture of hope and uncertainty. She didn't know what the future held, but she felt something different in the air. Maybe this time, things could be different. Maybe there was a chance for them all to heal. The days after John's meeting with the quadruplets were quiet, but the air between them felt different, thicker, yet full of possibility. The children were still processing everything. Their minds were filled with questions about their father, about why he had left, and what it would mean for their lives now. Each of them had their own feelings, their own memories, and it was clear that healing wouldn't be quick or easy. John had made the decision to stay in the area for a while, giving the children space to decide how they wanted to move forward. He knew it wasn't going to be simple. Trust didn't come easily, especially after years of silence and absence, but he was willing to wait. He wanted to prove to them, with his actions, that he was ready to be a part of their lives again. Megan watched as her children slowly started to come to terms with their feelings. Ethan, the oldest, seemed to be the most guarded. He had the most questions and was the least willing to let go of the hurt he felt. He would sometimes ask Megan why his father left, his voice filled with frustration. Even though he didn't say it, it was clear he was angry with John for missing so many important moments in his life. Mia, the second oldest, was more open to the idea of building a relationship with John. She understood the complexities of life better than her younger siblings and seemed to want to give their father a chance. Still, even she had doubts. Could he really change? Was it too late for him to make a difference in their lives? The younger two, Lily and Jack, were less concerned with the past. They didn't remember much about their father, and they seemed more curious than anything else. They asked John questions about his life, his work, and where he had been all these years. For them, the past wasn't something they carried in their hearts. They wanted to know the man who stood before them now. One evening, as Megan and John sat down for a conversation, John spoke quietly, his voice filled with remorse. "I know I can't change the past, but I want to be a part of their future," he said, his eyes filled with regret. "I want to be a better father this time. I just don't know where to begin." Megan looked at him, unsure of how to answer. She had spent so many years carrying the weight of raising the children alone that she wasn't sure how to let someone else into that space. But she also knew that her children deserved the chance to know their father. They deserved to make their own decisions about him, to see for themselves who he had become. "I know you want to be there for them, John," Megan said softly. "But they need time. They need to see that you're here to stay. You can't rush this." John nodded, understanding. He had spent too long running away from his responsibilities, and he knew it was up to him to prove he was ready to stay. But he also knew that healing didn't happen overnight. As the days passed, John made small efforts to connect with the children. He spent time with them individually, asking about their lives and showing interest in the things that mattered to them. Little by little, they began to soften, though there was still a long way to go. The road to rebuilding trust was just beginning. There would be moments of doubt, moments when the past seemed too heavy to bear, but John was determined to keep trying. He wasn't going to give up this time. He knew he couldn't change everything at once, But he hoped, with patience and time, that his family could heal. The weeks that followed were full of small, important steps. John didn't expect everything to be perfect, and he knew that trust couldn't be rebuilt overnight. But with each passing day, he began to see a change in his children. They were slowly starting to open up to him, though it wasn't easy for any of them. They had grown up without a father, and now that he was back, it felt strange to them. John didn't rush things. He spent time with the kids, learning about their lives, their dreams, and their fears. He asked questions about their school, their friends, and the things that made them happy. For the first time in years, he felt connected to them, even if it was just in small ways. He wasn't the same man he had been when he left, and he knew the kids could see that. Ethan, the oldest, was still the most distant. He would smile politely when John spoke, but his eyes told a different story. He had questions that were still unanswered. Why had John left? Why hadn't he come back sooner? The pain of his absence was still fresh, even after all these years. But there were moments when Ethan would open up, just a little, talking about his interests or telling John about a recent project at school. It was clear that Ethan wanted to connect, but the walls around his heart were still strong. Mia, the second oldest, had begun to soften. She would sit with John in the evenings, talking about everything and nothing. She seemed to understand that people made mistakes, and she was willing to give him a chance. It wasn't easy for her either. She had spent so many years learning to be independent, to take care of herself and her siblings. But slowly, she began to see the man who stood before her now, and not just the man who had walked away years ago. Lily and Jack, the youngest, were the easiest to connect with. They didn't remember much of their father's absence, and they were more open to getting to know him. They would ask him questions about his life, about what he had been doing all these years. They were curious and full of wonder, their hearts still innocent to the complexities of life. John cherished these moments with them, knowing that he had lost so much time with his older children, but he could still build something new with the younger ones. Megan watched from the sidelines, unsure of what to expect. She had been through so much on her own, raising 4 children by herself, and now, seeing John try so hard to be a part of their lives, she felt a mix of emotions. She was grateful that he was making an effort, but she also knew that this wasn't something that could be forced. The children had to decide for themselves what they wanted from him. One evening, after a quiet dinner, John looked at Megan, his eyes filled with a new sense of hope. "I'm not asking for everything to be perfect," he said. "I just want to be here for them. And for you, if you'll let me." Megan didn't say anything at first, but she smiled softly. It wasn't a promise, not yet, but it was a step forward. John had made the choice to return, to try, and that was enough for now. For the first time in years, there was hope in their home. The road to healing was still long, but it had begun. The family, though broken in some ways, was slowly coming together again. They all had their own paths to follow, but together, they could move forward, one step at a time. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks slowly turned into months. The family had made progress, but the road to healing was still long. John's return to their lives wasn't an instant fix. There were still moments of doubt, still feelings of hurt and confusion. But for the first time in years, there was a sense of hope. The past wasn't forgotten, but it wasn't as heavy as it had been before. John spent more time with the children, attending school events, helping with homework, and simply being there. It wasn't always easy, and there were times when the children pulled back, especially Ethan, who still carried the anger of being left behind. But even he began to soften, little by little. His moments of distance were sometimes followed by moments of understanding. He started to see that his father wasn't the same man who had walked away all those years ago. Mia, too, was learning to trust. She saw the effort John was putting in, and though her heart was still cautious, she didn't shut him out. She would often talk with him about her hopes for the future, sharing dreams and fears that she hadn't even told Megan. It was a small step, but it meant the world to John. She was letting him in, bit by bit. Lily and Jack, the younger two, were thriving with John's presence. They were excited to hear about his life, his work, and all the things they had missed while he was away. John cherished these moments, knowing they were forming memories that would last a lifetime. With them, he felt like he had a chance to build something new. They were so full of energy and curiosity, and it reminded him of the joy that had once filled their home. Megan watched all of this unfold with a mixture of emotions. She had spent so many years protecting her children from the pain of their father's absence. Now, as John slowly re-entered their lives, she wasn't sure how to feel. She had her own healing to do. She had learned to be independent, to do everything on her own. Letting John back in was a difficult choice, but it was one she knew she had to make for the children. They deserved the chance to know their father, and they deserved the chance to decide what kind of relationship they wanted with him. One evening, after a quiet family dinner, Megan and John sat together in the living room. The children were in their rooms, finishing their homework. John turned to Megan, his eyes full of gratitude. "I know I've messed up, and I can never take back the time I lost," John said softly. "But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. I want to be the father they deserve. I want to be the man you always hoped I could be." Megan looked at him, her heart full. "I know," she said quietly. "I see the effort you're making, and I'm not going to promise that everything will be perfect, but I'm willing to try. For the kids, for us." It wasn't a grand promise, but it was enough. It was a promise of effort, of trying, and of not giving up. In that moment, the family felt whole again. Maybe not perfect, but real. There were still wounds, still scars, but there was also love and hope. The past could never be erased, but it didn't have to define them. They were starting a new chapter, together, with open hearts and the courage to move forward. John had finally found his way back, and though the journey was far from over, it felt like they were on the right path at last.